Hello, I'm going to talk through the requirements for registering a Singapore Limited Company, go through the actual details of the registration of it, and then touch upon the ongoing compliance. So the requirements are broadly similar to what we see in Hong Kong and what you are all very familiar with. What I'd like to take note of are the following matters. First of all, just confirmation that foreign shareholders are absolutely allowed. There's no restriction on that. You don't need a local partner or a local shareholder. On the share capital matters, the minimum share capital is $1 Singapore, and you can add to that very simply as you go. The number of shareholders, there's a minimum shareholder level of 1, quite logical, and there's a maximum of 50. Those shareholders can be local, or again, they can be foreign, and they can be natural persons, or they can be corporate personalities, etc. Resident director, now this is a big difference from Singapore to Hong Kong. All Singapore companies have to have a resident director. That director has to have appropriate immigration rules, so they can't be a friend of yours working for a different company. They need to be entitled to work for this company as a director. In general, what we see is that people either use an external director for this service, and there's lots of people that do that, including my own firm, or they either replace that person or they hire someone to take on that role as part of their job. For example, if you were setting up a fund manager, initially when you set up that shell company, you'd use an external party, and then when you hire your investment manager, your CFO, etc., they would take on the role of that resident director. For other directors, there's no more restrictions than we have in Hong Kong and in other geographies. Company secretary, all entities have to have a company secretary. There is some wording around you have to appoint one within 6 months, but again, practically, the company secretary is appointed at the same time as incorporation. One slight difference between Hong Kong is that whilst in Hong Kong we have corporate company secretaries, in Singapore that company secretary must be a natural person. The way it works is that whilst there are companies who will provide these services, they will always appoint one of their own staff as such as your company secretary. Registered address, very similar to Hong Kong. It can't be a PO box, and please note that the public have to have access for 3 hours a day during normal business hours, Monday to Friday, and often that's actually something that ACRA will ask, and you'll have to confirm. And then the company name and the process on that, which is what we'll start on first. So the procedure for registration kicks off with getting the company name approved. Very obvious things here, restrictions such as it can't already be used. No one's already reserved it. It's not going to infringe on someone's trademarks. It's not rude. But there are other restrictions as well as we have in Hong Kong. So if you include, say, the term architect or Islam or some other protected terms such as finance, you have to get an additional licensing for that or permission. However, relevant for you, having the words fund manager in your name does not require pre-licensing or pre-permission, but ACRA have pointed out that if you conduct those activities, they expect you to be licensed. Once you've reserved the name, you actually have to register the company within 3 months, so you can't just hold these names there indefinitely. And if you are registering a name that is perhaps close to a trademark, it's good to note that that name can be challenged for 12 months from the date of registration, and you may be forced to change it, etc., etc. So the next step is to actually prepare the company registration documents, and again, like in Hong Kong, typically you get this to be done by your corporate services company. They prepare the company constitution, so that's similar to the Articles of Association. The signed consents to act as a director, so each director has to sign off to say that they're happy to be a director, as does the company secretary, and they collate the identification and residential address details for each shareholder and officer. And that's all very similar to Hong Kong. This is also when that service provider would generally do their KYC AML checks. Again, it's broadly similar to what we have in Hong Kong. Different companies have different requirements, but what will be there, but it's all pretty box standard. Once that's all collated, that can then go through and the agent will register the company with Accura. That's done online. It generally takes maybe under an hour, maybe 2 hours, and there are fees payable to the government for that, in addition to any kind of company services fee you're paying. So the name approval fee is very inexpensive at 15 Singapore dollars, and the company registration fee itself is 300 Singapore dollars. So that's very straightforward, and broadly I would say in line with your expectations from Hong Kong, with the exception of the resident director requirement. Now the ongoing compliance, where there's a few more differences perhaps to Hong Kong. It's very straightforward, but there are penalties for not getting this right, so it's well worthwhile getting together. First of all, the financial year end. You're free to choose a financial year end. It doesn't have to be the end of the calendar year, and the Singapore calendar year is December 31. But most companies we see choose the end of a quarter. It is worth thinking about any tax incentives that you're getting. So we have some clients who get zero tax exemptions for new startup companies, and so they have kept their first financial year to 365 days to ensure they get the full allowance of that tax benefit. The appointment of auditors, whilst in Hong Kong this is mandatory, in Singapore it is possible for some companies to exempt out of that. Broadly small companies, so that's based on the number of shareholders, which most of these fund managers will get, and annual turnover being less than a few million Singapore dollars, currently around 5 million Singapore dollars. If you can do that, then you cannot be audited, which is obviously good if you're just doing this as a shell company and before you're actually up and ready with your license. If you do need to appoint an auditor, you need to do that within 3 months from the date of incorporation, and that's just a simple director's board minute as such to do that. It's worth noting that your company registration number, as we'd know it in Hong Kong, is called your unique entity number, and that needs to be disclosed on all business letters, statements of account, invoices, official notices, publications, etc. There's a very large prominence of that number within Singapore. As in all territories, as you change directors' details or shareholder details or registered office details, you need to inform Accura of that on the required form, and that's something that your company secretary will do, but obviously you need to tell them that you've changed your address, for example. Now a big difference is GST. So GST, which stands for Goods and Service Tax, very similar to VAT, those of you from the UK. It's a tax on the supply of goods and services in Singapore. There are some items that are exempt from that, but the current GST rate is 7%. You have to register it if you expect your annual taxable revenue to be more than 1 million Singapore dollars. And you need to make that registration within 30 days of believing that you need to make the registration. You can also register for it voluntarily, and that is at the discretion of the tax office. If you do voluntarily register, you have to remain registered for at least 2 years, so you can't kind of pick and choose what you do here. The benefit of registering is you can claim back any GST that you're spending. What I see with a lot of my clients is they don't register because the percentage of GST within the business is not huge. Their payroll costs are essentially the largest. We'll come on to payroll soon. Next is accounting. Similar to Hong Kong, you need to keep books and records up to date and accurate. I guess one difference is that if you are doing GST returns regularly, monthly, quarterly, etc., then your accounts need to be up to date much more quickly. And that's why a lot of people will engage an external party just to ensure that they are then making their GST returns properly. On employment, broadly similar to Hong Kong, rather than MPF, there's something called CPF. Good to note that expats don't pay CPF, but they will still make some other contributions. And there are a lot of other kind of government taxes or contributions payable. So there's things like temple funds and such like, all dependent on the ethnicity of the employee themselves. This is actually quite a complicated area, and something that most clients of mine are happy that they don't have to do, and they've pushed out to us to work out those numbers and do. CPF is payable monthly. On insurance, as well as the normal insurances that you might offer as standard, some points to mention here. Expats generally get health insurance from their company in Singapore, as the government system is not as good for expats in Singapore as the system is in Hong Kong for expats. And also the workers' compensation insurance, which we have in Hong Kong, isn't required for entities that don't have manual labour, unless their employees for non-manual labour are inexpensive, and that number is changes from time to time. From what we've seen is that some of our clients have, when they hire an investment manager, clearly they're being paid a significant amount, but when they hire a support staff or a part-time staff, they drop below the 2,100 Singapore dollars, which is the threshold for a salary. And that's excluding overtime payment, bonus payment, etc. And they then need to go out and get this insurance, which means sometimes they forget they have to do that. Your payroll compliance people should be telling you and prompting you that you need to get this. But that's a cost that you need to think about budgeting. So that's it. So we've spoken about what you need to incorporate, the incorporation process itself, and then we've touched on the actual compliance side. Any questions, please ask as part of this session, or feel free to reach out to me afterwards. Thank you very much.